Hello, so we'll get started with our next CA, and our speaker is John D'Angelo. He is the Director of League Economics and Strategy at the MLB, and he will be talking about avoiding Tommy John surgery.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So, as she mentioned, I'm John D'Angelo. I work in the Labor Relations Department at Major League Baseball. And, one of our responsibilities is for league-wide health and safety initiatives, which includes our electronic medical record system, as well as any injury research programs. So this morning, I'm going to talk about an area that we've spent a lot of time on over the past couple of years, which is trying to reduce the number of ulnar collateral ligament and injuries and Tommy John surgeries that we have at all levels of baseball. So before I get started, I just want to touch briefly on the data that I'll be presenting today. So we have a league-wide electronic medical record system that all clubs have been required to use since 2010, and it contains comprehensive medical information on players. We use that information for league-wide injury research projects in collaboration with our Players Association as well as our club medical staffs, and we also have joint epidemiologists at Johns Hopkins University. We don't share that data publicly until it's ready for peer review medical journals. So today I'm going to be talking and relying primarily on publicly available information, and mostly from a website called baseballheatmaps.com that actually has the best publicly available database of Tommy John surgeries going back to 1974. So with that, I think at first we want to just take you guys back to where we were in the spring of 2014, which is when a lot of these issues came to a head, and we started to take some action in this area. There are basically four trends at the commissioner's office that were particularly concerning to us. The first is that there was a dramatic increase in the number of Tommy John surgeries at the MLB level. The second is that there is a corresponding increase in the number of players who were undergoing a second Tommy John surgery in their careers. The third is that not only were players having the surgery more often at the professional level, but they were also having it more often at the youth and high school level. And finally, there were a lot of misperceptions that had grown over time about Tommy John surgery, how it was sort of a procedure that players should have before they get injured to improve their performance that contributed to this overall kind of problem in this area. So, as I mentioned, we actually reached an all-time high in disabled list days for elbow injuries from 2012 to 2014. And as you can see on this chart here, it's actually a 72% increase relative to the 3 years prior to 2012 to 2014. We also saw a similar increase in the number of Tommy John surgeries at the major league level. After, I think, the previous high had been 22, and it spiked to 36 in 2012 and 31 in 2014. Not only were we having more Tommy John surgeries, but the players who were having these surgeries were younger. So on this chart, you can see we've bucketed over a 20-year period into 5-year periods how many players who were 25 or younger at the major league level had the surgery. And as you can see, it's a dramatic increase relative to any other time in history. Not only were these players young, but they were some of the best young pitchers in baseball. So, here's a list of players who had Tommy John surgery in the 2013, early 2014 seasons. And, two players who stand out are Matt Harvey and Jose Fernandez, who had finished in the top 4 in the NL Cy Young in 2013. But overall, we were losing a lot of our best pitchers for upwards of 12 to 16 months while they recovered from this injury. As I mentioned, more players were having second Tommy John surgeries. So again, we looked at that 20-year period from 1995 to 2014, and you can see a steady increase in the number of players who were having second Tommy John surgeries. A particularly concerning trend for us because preliminary research in that area showed that players who had a second Tommy John surgery did not come back as strongly as players who had a first Tommy John surgery. And then outside of the professional level, data was harder to come by because we didn't have a centralized medical record system. These things aren't tracked as closely. But our medical experts were telling us that the problem was equal or greater at the youth level. So here's a chart showing at the Andrews Sports Medicine Institute, which is Dr. James Andrews, who's one of the leading orthopedists in this field, the percentage of Tommy John surgeries that he performed on youth and high school players as a percentage of the total number of players that he performed surgery on. So in 1994, it was basically unheard of. And by the late 2000s, 2010, it was about roughly a third of all of his patients. In the 2 years since, there's actually been some research that's come out that's supported this hypothesis. So these are 2 studies which were published in the American Journal of Sports Medicine in 2015 and 2016. And what these doctors did is sort of took a very innovative approach where they looked at insurance records, both on a state level and a national level. And what they found was that, again, we saw the greatest increase in this surgery over a multi-year period of time was occurring in the 15 to 20-year age group. So again, those high school, early college players. And then finally, I spoke a little bit about the misperceptions about the surgery. So there's these myths that came up over time that, surgery is always successful, you have it, you come back less than a year later, and you're throwing harder and performing better than you ever had. And Dr. Ahmad from the Yankees designed a survey that went to youth players, coaches, and parents. And what he asked them was, what are your perceptions of how successful the surgery is, how long it takes, and if you'll come back and throw harder? And what we saw is that more than half of high school players thought that you should have Tommy John surgery without actually having an elbow injury. And more than half of college players thought that your pitching speed, that on average, players' pitching speed increases following having the surgery. Now, all of our research and all the research of the medical community had shown that this was incorrect and that this wasn't a pro-performance surgery. This was something that is very helpful if you have a serious injury, but in no way would you want to have this surgery if you can avoid it. So that's sort of the problem that we were facing in 2014. And the commissioner's office decided to take a series of steps, to try and reduce the number of injuries that were occurring at all levels. The first thing we did is we formed a committee of the leading medical experts in the area. So here's the original group that we first convened in 2014. Dr. Andrews is on this list. Dr. Fleissig, who's Dr. Andrews' research director, was also on this list. And then the other people on the group were team physicians and different medical researchers that had been identified as being the experts in this field. And the first thing they told us was, again, that the single greatest factor contributing to this problem was at the youth level, that players were pitching too much and not resting enough at the youth level, and that behavior was not only leading to injuries at the youth level, but players at the professional level were being injured more often because of their behavior when they were younger. So they showed us a ton of research that they had done over a many-year period, which showed us that a lot of these behaviors, which are very modifiable, had been highly correlated with injury among the youth group. So I think the best study looked at over a 10-year period at youth players and showed that players who had pitched 100 or more innings in a given year were exponentially more likely to suffer a serious arm injury than players who didn't pitch that 100 innings in a single year. It wasn't just medical experts that were saying this. Across baseball, general managers, coaches, and players were saying that players were specializing in sports at a younger age, that they were playing baseball sort of year-round without rest, and that they were accumulating these pitch counts in individual games that were putting them at a serious risk of injury. So what we did is we decided that we wanted to take all of this research and all of this insight that the medical community had gathered over many years and bring it to a wider audience to increase awareness of the fact that by pitching too much and not having enough rest, not playing multiple sports, that you were putting yourself at an increased risk for injury. You weren't really furthering your chances of being an elite player at a higher level. So we partnered with USA Baseball to create Mart, which is an educational initiative to promote that research and promote safe pitching practices among youth players. There's 3 main components to the initiative. The first is that all of our medical professionals advocated pitch count limits and required rest guidelines. So the idea is if you throw 50 pitches, you'd have to wait 2 days before pitching again in a game, which I think is a pretty intuitive concept. But we didn't see adoption of those type of restrictions at many levels of youth baseball. The second was to synthesize all the research into more digestible information for players and coaches, again, just so that they can understand why we are coming up with these guidelines and recommendations. And finally, we just wanted to provide more accurate information about Tommy John surgery so that players understood this is something I want to avoid, not something I want to have. So on this chart, you can just see what our required our pitch count limits and required rest recommendations are. So essentially, it goes from age 7 to age 22, and gradually you're allowed to throw more pitches in a given day before you'd have to be removed from the game. And additionally, sort of going across the going across the rows, based on the number of pitches you throw in a given game, you have to rest for a certain amount of time before you can come back into a game. And then our research committee provided a series of other recommendations, and these were more in the research area. These are questions that they wanted to answer that would provide practical and actionable information for them when they're trying to care for players. So the first is that at the youth level, there was a lot of understanding of what created risk of injury for pitchers. But at the professional level, there's still a lot of questions about whether a player's biomechanics mattered, whether his usage mattered, how hard he threw, and we didn't really have great answers in this area. So, and why this is so important is that once you identify the risk factors, then you can just start to design preventative programs to reduce the risk of injury. The second is the rehab process and this growing problem of revisions. So, could we adjust the rehab process or adjust future usage to make it less likely that players would have a second Tommy John surgery, or that the success rate of coming back from this procedure would be even higher? Third, everyone talks about Tommy John surgery, as a single procedure, but there's actually many variations on how it's done. You can use a different graft, you can use a different technique to actually perform the procedure. And so understanding whether those variations and how you do the surgery actually affects the likelihood of success in future injury. And then finally, as I mentioned, Tommy John surgery requires a 12 to 16-month rehab process. It's a very intense rehab process. You're out for a long period of time. And so, something that our physicians were interested in is are there alternative therapies that can be used to allow players to come back sooner and not miss as much time? So this could be, alternative procedures, or it could just be, resting before trying to rehab the injury and avoid surgery altogether. So this all occurred in 2014. We rolled out Mart in November 2014, and in the 2 years since, we've been working on getting, increasing adoption of the Mart guidelines and principles, as well as furthering our research projects. So in terms of where we are today, I think Mart has been very successful in terms of changing the youth baseball landscape. So USA Baseball has really taken the lead in working with youth organizations to adopt pitch count guidelines and required rest. Here's a list of all the organizations who are fully compliant with Mart, which means all of their events follow pitch count and required rest guidelines. So you can see there's big organizations like Little League, which has actually had these guidelines in place before Mart, but showcase circuits like Perfect Game and in college summer leagues across the country, including the Cape Cod League. And then probably one of our greatest achievements has actually been at the high school level. So when we rolled out Mart in 2014, these type of guidelines were almost non-existent at the high school level. The only state who had a pitch count limit or a pitching limit that was based on pitch counts was Vermont. But in 2016, the National Federation of State High School Associations actually voted to institute a rule that would mandate that states adopt a pitching restriction guideline that's based on pitch counts and required rest. So not all the states have adopted exactly what you would see on the Mart website, but it's the idea of preventing overuse injuries by limiting the amount of pitches you can throw on a given day and allowing your body to rest before going out there again. As you can see, in 2017, 44 of 46 states who actually legislate baseball rules at the high school level have pitch count limits, with the only holdouts being Connecticut and Massachusetts. So then, we've also just spent a lot of time monitoring these trends to see if there's anything that's changing over time, if there's anything that's particularly concerning to us that we have to turn our attention to in terms of research. I think one thing that we've felt is positive is that the number of Tommy John surgeries at the major league level has really kind of leveled off over the past couple of years. So, I think it's still a significant problem. We still have, roughly 20 to 25 players who have this procedure every year. But we didn't see the exponential growth in this that we were concerned we'd see after that spike from 2012 to 2014. Additionally, this is another way of looking at the concept of young players having the surgery more often. So this is a chart showing the number of players who were drafted having already had Tommy John surgery, whether they're at the youth or professional level, or youth or college, or sorry, whether they had it at high school or college. And you can see it was a steady upward trend from 2009 to 2014. Again, it's kind of leveled off. I mean, we set a all-time high in 2016, but it's been relatively flat over the last 3-year periods. And it's not to say that the overuse at the youth level is not an important issue for us to be focusing on, but more that we haven't seen this problem worsen. It's just kind of leveled off. And then in terms of research, so Major League Baseball has partnered with the Major League Baseball Players Association to conduct a series of research projects. The most significant one is a long-term prospective study where we ask players right when they're drafted to undergo a series of baseline tests. So we have them take a shoulder and elbow MRI. We have them go through a full biomechanical evaluation, do a playing history questionnaire, and then we actually follow them for the rest of their careers. So I mentioned that we have this EMR system. So we don't need to go to them in 5 years and say, did you get injured playing professional baseball? We already know that, right? So it's kind of, it really helps us in our research that we don't need to continually go back to these players and ask them, because it kind of eliminates any participation or dropout rate. But what we'll do is we'll follow them for the rest of their careers to track their performance and their usage and their future injuries, and see whether any of those baseline tests or the future behavior is correlated with injury. And that can help us start to identify preventative programs for how to limit these risk factors. So far, about 225 players have enrolled, and we anticipate roughly 400 being enrolled by the end of when we finish collecting baseline information. Additionally, there's been a ton of research that's been published in peer-reviewed medical journals. A lot of this has provided some preliminary promising results. The first is on risk factors for injury. So 3 studies came out in the last year which started to show behaviors that or characteristics that might be associated with a risk of UCL injury. I think not surprisingly, we saw that greater fastball usage, throwing harder, pitching more in individual games and not resting as much were associated with an increased risk of injury. But again, this is a very preliminary field, and they're, again, relying on publicly available information. So this is something where I think it's going to take a fair amount of time to actually see more actionable results. However, one area where we actually have seen some very promising studies is in the conservative care and rehab area. So these are 2 studies that were done by team physicians looking at their own players. The first was done by the Colorado Rockies, and what they did is looked at players who had partial UCL tears. So they didn't have the full tear that would automatically lead to a player needing surgery. But instead, they were in that middle ground where they might need to have surgery, but they might not. And what they found was that if you just let the player rest for 6 to 8 weeks, 93% of them came back and pitched without needing the surgery. So again, should we be more conservative in terms of how we approach these injuries, not just automatically push to surgery? Again, it's with 43 players, so it's tough to really draw too many conclusions from that. But the Cleveland Indians doctor, Mark Schickendance, actually conducted a very similar study, and what he looked at was whether the location of the tear would actually help you predict who would come back successfully. And what he found is that players who had distal tears were actually much more likely to fail the rehab and need surgery than players who had proximal tears. So the medical community is starting to get sort of more strategic and accurate about what type of injuries what type of injury lends itself to a conservative care, while other types of injuries, you probably should just opt for the surgery and kind of come back more quickly. So Related to this is the use of orthobiologics, or PRP, or stem cells. So here, you're not just resting for a period of time before starting to throw again, but you're actually getting an injection of an orthobiologic to sort of spur that recovery along. And that's become an increasingly popular option for players over the past few years. And I think one of the challenges here is that, again, the research sometimes lags behind what the medical community moves toward. So there's a lot of optimism about the use of this technology, but there haven't been many peer-reviewed articles that have actually shown it's more effective than rest and rehab alone. And this is actually kind of an interesting comparison. You have two doctors from Kerlan-Jobe in Los Angeles, Dr. Steve Yoon and Dr. Neil Alatrash, and Dr. Alatrash is on our Mart committee. Dr. Yoon has seen, was interviewed after working with a player last year, and he said that he's seen, anecdotally, some very successful results with stem cells compared to PRP, and that he thinks that's a more useful route, even though, but with the caveat that they don't have, full research available on that topic. And Dr. Alatrash, I think, makes the same point, right, is that with all of these, you're having the guy wait a certain period of time, whether it's 3, 4, 6, 8 weeks. And as we saw in the previous slide, 93% of players who waited 6 to 8 weeks came back without needing the surgery. So is it the rest, or is it the orthobiologic? And I think that that's one of those questions that we need to flesh out in the coming years. And this is just kind of showing, this slide is just showing the players at the major league level who use PRP or stem cells in 2016 based on baseball heat maps records. And so again, this kind of illustrates, I think, the uncertainty that we see in this space, right? Michael Lorenzen successfully came back after having an injection and rehabbing. But 3 of these pitchers have already had surgery, and 4 are currently waiting to see what happens. They're working their way back. They're likely to start pitching games soon in spring training. But it just illustrates the fact that there's still a lot to learn about this area, and it's difficult to make any sweeping statements based on the data that we have available right now. Then 2 final points. I think the first is that clubs are always looking for ways to gain a competitive advantage over others. And so they've been very proactive in terms of using technology and different training methods to try and avoid and reduce injuries. So here's a list of some of the devices that teams have used, try and more scientifically track fatigue, risk of injury, stress, variables like that. Driveline is one I wanted to talk about briefly, which is a little bit different. What they do is they actually are an outfit based out of Seattle who does a lot of research on pitching mechanics, pitching performance, and how that correlates with injury. They have some unorthodox training methods, but they've become very popular among a select group of teams who feel like they sort of figured out a better way of training players for peak performance while not putting them at increased risk of injury. So again, it's tough to tell whether this actually helps, how accurate it is, but I think what you'll start to see is, what we see in general is that, when a team's successful in one area, other teams start to adopt, similar training methods. So this is another area where we kind of, in the commissioner's office, just monitor and watch it, and look for trends and how we can help teams make those decisions. And finally, I think we touched on this a little bit, but there's always been this question of, is there a different procedure that can help players come back sooner than the 12 to 16 months? Dr. Dugas at Andrews Sports Medicine is kind of the early pioneer of this UCL Repair technique, which actually you repair the UCL instead of replacing it, and you use orthopedic tape to augment that repair. And the expected recovery for that is 6 months as opposed to 12 to 16. So he tried it out on a number of high school and college players, and I think he would be the first to tell you that this is an experimental procedure that's only meant for players who have certain types of tears. But the early results from that lower level was positive, and 2 Cardinals pitchers actually have had the procedure and will soon be coming back and pitching, and they expect to be ready for spring training, which if they had had Tommy John surgery, they would most likely be out for the entire year. So again, this is another area where there's a lot of optimism, a lot of interest. But I think the good thing is the medical community approaches all of this with skepticism and waits for research to back up the use of these strategies. So that's sort of an overview of what we've been doing over the past few years. I think, again, this is very a continually evolving area. So in a couple years, we'll probably have a lot more information on a lot of these topics. But happy to answer any questions that you guys might have.
You present data at the major league level. Do you have the data for all professional baseball, and was the major league level representative of what it would be for all major league baseball, or all professional baseball?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we have this electronic medical record system that every major and minor league team uses. So we do track these injuries at the minor league level, and really that's actually much better for us just because the numbers are so much greater. It's very similar. I think, again, it's tough to judge 1 or 2 year trends, but we're not seeing any, kind of linear upward trajectory. It's sort of, kind of goes up and down, but it's very similar.
Do you share this with the Japanese professional leagues? Have you done work with them?
We have spoken to them about it. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for studying the differences between Japanese professional leagues and the American leagues. But again, it's I think they're very open. There is actually some interesting differences in like the mound height and in the baseball type that we've looked at, and whether those have any correlation with injury. But yeah, we definitely look at other leagues and what they're doing. Yeah, so we actually did a prevalence study a few years ago where Stan Conti, who used to be the Dodgers trainer, spearheaded this, and we actually looked at prevalence of Tommy John surgery at the minor league and major league level, and we've actually looked, we didn't find any difference in terms of the demographics, so it's tough to tell whether that's sort of something that may appear later now that we have all of this year-round youth baseball, and it just hasn't emerged yet. But right now, we haven't found any major statistical differences.
There's this sort of prevalent idea in the Wisconsin crowd that we're babying pitchers, et cetera. What would be the most effective evidence that you've come across to debunk that?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is that the way the game's played over time changes, and so I think that players have never, thrown harder or been asked to be used in the same way. So it's difficult to say that a player who pitched 30 years ago, if he's exerting more stress on every pitch by throwing harder and throwing sliders as opposed to changeups and curveballs, that that those are apples to apples, and so you can just compare innings pitched totals across those leagues. But I think the data kind of suggests that players, even though teams are trying to be more progressive, that injuries are increasing. So clearly something needs there's some reason that players are getting injured more often, more than just players are being babied. So. So we do not specifically in the EMR. We are working on some projects where we actually work with a select group of teams and sort of track more granular data about how they're training. I think the problem is just that teams are kind of very protective of this information, as you can imagine. So they feel like this is a competitive advantage. I don't want to share this with all the teams because if we find out that this is better, we've invested all this time and now they reap the rewards. So there's just a balance of finding teams who are willing to kind of collaborate, but also protecting their efforts in the space.
Yeah, is this a global phenomenon? Are we reaching the edge of human performance, or is it that we're just training incorrectly?
Yeah, that might be a little bit beyond my scope. I think if you were to talk to some of our, we have very kind of the leading medical research in these areas who advise us, and I think that, yeah, they would say that, throwing a baseball is kind of an unnatural motion, and you put an incredible amount of stress on your arm every time. So it's not surprising that, these players have injuries. I guess the question is, can you, kind of reduce the amount of injuries? You're never going to eradicate it. But yeah, I think it is an inherently stressful task.
I'm a pitcher, and I recently went through the college training conference. One of the things I noticed is that there's this huge emphasis on throwing hard. You're not throwing hard, you're not throwing hard. Do you think that if coaches and teams put less emphasis on velocity and more emphasis on other aspects of pitching, that now the surgeries among high school and college students?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that a lot of the evidence suggests that throwing harder puts you at an increased risk of injury. There's also a lot of evidence that shows that throwing harder improves performance. So, if you throw harder, you're more likely to be better to get to the higher levels. And so it's tough to tell someone not to throw as hard because they might have an increased risk of injury. Just because they might, that's going to be essential to actually performing well. So we've had a lot of discussions about what the balance is. I think the point is you shouldn't focus on throwing hard to the exclusion of, mechanics and, being able to locate the ball. And so it's just kind of finding a balance between all those different factors. I think that's it. So,
At what point, I know that you implemented the USA Baseball as a pitch recommendation that was presented at the ABCA conference, but at what point do you think, or is there any plans for MLB to actually use its power to influence the NCAA in terms of recruiting windows for baseball? The timelines for baseball are a lot larger. It's very different from other sports where the windows for opportunity to evaluate are a lot wider, so kids throw pretty much year-round, and if you, I guess in theory, eliminated some of those windows for those kids to actually showcase themselves, that you could automatically shut down some of these throwing issues that youth baseball has?
yeah, my office has a kind of a very, regular working relationship with the NCAA. So I know that we talk about, issues like that all the time. But again, it's a lot of different issues there. But I think, having kids take a certain amount of rest every year has been proven to reduce injury, and that's always better if players take, a certain amount of time every year. So, all right, thanks everyone.